Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be more of my thoughts on Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. So I have seen it for a second time. I saw it last night again. And yeah, I have a little bit more to say. Obviously, the first video I did a few days ago was like literally just after coming back from my first screening. So it was very much like the feelings on the movie were kind of very raw. So it was just sort of scattered thoughts. I've been able to sort of compose them a little bit since then, but it's still very much like still a case of like, wow, did they really end the Skywalker saga like that? Why did they want to make it the last movie? What were they thinking type thing? In that, spoilers, like my opinion hasn't really changed that much from the first video. But there's definitely some stuff I want to talk about. First of all, something I didn't really get a chance to talk about in the first video, the action. I just feel that fundamentally, especially watching it the second time, none of the action in this movie is very memorable, like at all. Any of the action aspects of this movie, not particularly good at all. The space battles especially are very generic, like super generic for being the final battle. You don't get, even the kind of skipping around the place stuff, you know, towards the start, it's still not particularly great. It's just like, okay, light speed hopping is a kind of interesting concept. It's a pretty basic, you know, standard, you know, dogfight in the tunnel. And then pretty much after that, it's just like kind of skipping towards the end for like the big fight in space. And it's, you know, the Resistance fleet versus the Final Order fleet, and it's just not a very good setup for a battle because of the way they shoot it, and that like it's like, okay, how many of these things are there? This is huge thing. They have such a small fleet, and then they sort of, you know, have them go down, but then Lando arrives with everyone else, and you kind of don't really get to see what the rest of the fleet does. Like the Falcon gets to do a bit, but then they're just there to kind of be numbers, and they never note kind of who they are. Like there's a line of like they're just people, but like I think people have broken it down, and there's like the ghost in there, so it's clearly not just people. It's like the former rebellion sort of groups and factions, and so like where's the references and stuff like that? Where's what these ships do that is so impressive? Not to mention just some of the kind of logic behind the scene of like, really, Palpatine's final order fleet is one, you know, hidden in ice on a planet with absolutely awful weather that will restrict those ships from launching and take ages to launch. And the way you launch them is by having one small control tower on the ground, which can be switched to running off a Death Star, and they still take ages to actually get out of exegol orbit to activate their shields. And it's just like, really, like that was your best explanation for this? It just made them feel so like kind of pointless. It made the plan just seem so terrible, in that if Palpatine has as many followers, whatever his followers were, as it seems, like all those things, are they people, are they troopers? I'm so confused about so much of the detail around Palpatine. I'll get to that. If he has so many supporters, like why did this all have to take place just on this planet Exegol? Was there no planet anywhere nearby that had a better atmosphere to launch from, and that the things would have been over if not for that? So just some of those kind of contrivances are frustrating, and just the battle wasn't great. Like we didn't really get to see Poe do anything in the battle. The Falcon, similarly, like in the grand scheme of things, didn't get to do anything particularly unique. There was no clever stuff going on in the same way that it was very clear in, say, like the trench run battle in Episode 4, what was happening, or the run through the Death Star in Episode 6. None of that. Even Episode 7, at least, even though it was kind of a direct kind of copy in a way of like what was going on before, it was at least a direct, here's what's happening. This was just so vague and all over the place. Similarly with the ground battles, of like the amount of times like the stormtroopers are just made to be absolute idiots here. And I know it's always been the case in Star Wars, but this movie felt particularly like egregious about that, of just like Finn, Poe, and Rey just get off the ship and they're just like taking everyone down. Like like so many stormtroopers go down looking so silly, and then even towards the end of the movie, you bring in the Sith troopers, the red stormtroopers. They don't say anything about them. Get across that they're meant to be like much more skilled than everyone else. They just go down the exact same as everyone else. No detail about them whatsoever, and the exact same goes for the Knights of Ren. What like are they not a bigger joke as a group than like Phasma was as a character in terms of the way they were used across these movies? Like the setup from episode 7 of like the Master of the Knights of Ren, I think they're kind of teased in one of like Rey's visions and stuff like that, and they end up just being absolute jokes. In that the second Kylo Ren gets a lightsaber, they're just gone, and then throughout the rest of the movie just seems to be like, hey, they kind of look cool as a group. Let's have them stand across this like mountain that they clearly had to like climb all the way up on to look cool, and just do a swing around shot. And then clearly afterwards they have to like climb down from it. So it was some really silly stuff of like trying to make them look cool, but ultimately not having them do anything in the movie. So just super wasted potential with them. And then yeah, once again, like your big moment in this movie in terms of ground battle was that like kind of Finn came up with the idea to land, you know, mounted units basically on on a Star Destroyer in atmosphere. And look, it was a fun enough moment of them being like, block the repulsor lift stuff for their speeders, and they're like, they're not using speeders, and they kind of charge in. But like pretty much like after just that initial like they run down the Death Star, those horse things are not really needed anymore because everyone's off the horses because they're too awkward to use in a full battle, and so it has to just be like them on foot doing what they need to do. And so it's kind of like, what was the point of that if you were just going to immediately have them get off? Like, could you not have actually just had them land even more troops on board the thing instead of like taking up space with horses, which would be quick but ultimately not particularly useful in the battle. And it's just stuff like that throughout like the whole movie of just like a lack of foresight and putting sort of spectacle above all else. In that, I think the big thing with the original 6 movies, and even some of like 7 and 8 to a degree, was that like there's always a sense of like storytelling within the fights, and it's not really here outside of just plot is happening. And you know, there's this stuff of like Palpatine takes out the fleet for a second, and then once Rey defeats Palpatine, you know, they're able to counteract that. You know, that's, you know, the storytelling you expect. But the actual story of the battles themselves, of like the trench run, you need to have, you know, backup in the trench run, because if you go in alone you're going to be taken out, and that sort of stuff, that storytelling of the logic of the battle isn't quite here. And then we get to the lightsaber fights. You guys know, and if you've seen any of my other reviews of this other Star Wars movies, lightsaber fights are kind of my favorite action stuff in Star Wars. It's why I think the prequels are so why I like the prequels so much. And unfortunately, the sequel trilogy ends without a single good lightsaber fight. We actually get a bunch of either small sequences or larger sequences of the characters, you know, actually having a lightsaber fight here. So they counteract the problem with 8 that it didn't have any lightsaber fights to actually have a lot of them, but still no interesting or good choreography, no real storytelling within the battle itself. And again, I think I've been able to focus in on what the problem is. The main problem is that for some reason they're directing the characters to treat the lightsaber like it's some sort of a battle axe, that it's like super heavy and like just go out like you're swinging a baseball bat and you're trying to hit as hard as you can. Whereas all they needed to do was not hit as hard, up the pace a bit, and have the characters look more skilled. Throughout this entire movie, the problem with Rey and Kylo, as much as they fight, is ultimately that the two of them both just swing like crazy at each other. So it doesn't allow for very interesting choreography. Because when you do those big wild swings, there's only one way to block it. And then there's only one real way to follow up, because you're putting so much effort into the swing. And so it just makes the fight feel repetitive rather than powerful like they were trying to go for. And there's little hints that there's something in there, and that you see Rey and Kylo do a little kind of spin of like they go around one way, then use the momentum to come around the other. It happens like once in a while, but the way the big fight on the Death Star wreckage is shot, it's so terribly shot in terms of, it feels like anytime they actually have a good sequence, the camera pans way out, like so far out that you're mainly seeing the scenery rather than the action. And so it's just these two dots like clashing lightsabers rather than it being shot up close and focusing on the choreography. And it's a case of like it doesn't really tell much of a story because it is just a bunch of sequences of just very simple, clash, 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 maybe a downward strike ever so often. There's like one or two kind of spins included, but they never clash more than like maybe 3 or 4 times in a sequence. There's never any unique or clever kind of lockups or way that they kind of have a sequence end. It's just boom, 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 jump over a wave, boom, 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 jump over a wave. Oh, the fight is over. The plot requires the fight to be over at this point. We'll have Leia come in and do what she does and have the fight end in the plot way that it does. Which is fine at the end. It's just that you didn't really tell much of a story in the middle, in the sense of like, is Rey meant to be more skilled here compared to the other movies? Because it didn't feel like that. In that she just felt like she was swinging the lightsaber in the exact same way that she was swinging it in 7 and 8, despite having all this extra training. In that I really don't actually know why they didn't have Rey like kind of build her own double-bladed lightsaber in between movies. Because anytime you see Rey use a staff, she feels so much more skilled and composed with it. And I think that was sort of meant to be emphasized with the fact that that was her kind of go-to weapon back on Jakku before she even knew she was Force sensitive. So I don't know why they left the reveal that she's made her own lightsaber to the very end of the movie when you're not going to do anything with it. And then you do that reveal, and it's clearly meant to be a double-bladed lightsaber, just the way it's constructed. Like, it's a little short in terms of a handle for a double-bladed lightsaber, but, still the idea, it can still be double-bladed. Why does she only ignite one end of it? And like, the fact that it's yellow is sort of unique. Like, we've seen the color yellow before, of course. Jedi Sentinels kind of have that. We've seen that in Rebels and stuff like that. I think the Clone Wars had it for at least a second or two. Like, what is the significance of Rey kind of having the color yellow beyond just unique kind of thing? It's just like, where was that lightsaber in the middle of the movie? Because I think that would have at least made it unique. You would have had to actually have good choreography, because a double-bladed lightsaber against a single-bladed lightsaber always creates a somewhat unique dynamic. Even if you're just doing the most basic choreography, it's at least different than what you've done before. And so I don't know why they didn't do that. In that the sequences in this movie that are better with the lightsaber are actually like the tiny sequence where it's Dark Rey versus Rey, because it is double-bladed versus single-bladed. It's the best lightsaber sequence in the entire sequel trilogy is the flashback scene with young Luke and Leia during Leia's training. That felt exactly like, the sort of thing I'd want Kylo and Rey to be doing, but they weren't doing it. Even the sequences where it is just them using their lightsaber against people who don't have a lightsaber, like Kylo, when he gets the Anakin lightsaber, actually starts to do some interesting maneuvers, because it feels like he's now using a normal lightsaber and he's not using this battle axe thing that is this like lethal kind of weapon thing that he needs to swing around like crazy, like it's a club. And it's just like, where was the consistency? Like why was Nick Gillard not brought on for this movie to do some choreography and make some of this stuff work? The only thing in the big fight that they do that is in any way sort of interesting, and even then I don't think it's executed very well, is they have a sequence where, first of all, Kylo uses his blade in a reverse grip, just for like a second or two. And then there's like a sequence, they go on, and then Rey does the exact same thing, just for a sequence. And it just felt so like odd the way it was done, of like the way that they transitioned was just felt really slow, of just like they're like, and now I'm doing this. And it showed how awkward the reverse grip is. Like, none of these characters are Ahsoka Tano, who's like is emphasizes that, and even then Ahsoka, they later on give her, of course, the second lightsaber to counteract the problem with like a reverse grip and stuff like that. It shows like the weakness of trying to do a lightsaber fight like that, and that like you only have so much strength trying to block something by holding it in such a reverse grip like this. So I don't know what they were really hoping to accomplish there, especially when Kylo does it, he stops doing it, then Rey does it, and it's like, okay, like, was that meant to be some sort of a style change? But like, you didn't really have a style before. Why are you trying to introduce it here, just with a reverse grip type thing? It's just like, okay. In the same way that, like, you know, if Rey has two lightsabers, like, why doesn't she ever like use the two of them together to actually like fight? I get like the way the sequencing of like the plot worked, like there was no real way to do it, perhaps, but you know, it's just stuff like that where it's like, you know, there's a way to do it. Like, I think Rey probably might have worked a bit better by just having her use two lightsabers, and that anytime I see Daisy Ridley like holding a single bladed lightsaber in two hands, it just feels a bit awkward that she doesn't know, she doesn't have the confidence to do it. And then like you look back at the prequels, and like you look at the behind the scenes stuff of Ewan McGregor in like episode 1 and then in episode 3. He's like an expert at lightsaber combat by the end of that. Like, he's really good at the style and like holding a blade and stuff like that. So that's just all that like action stuff I think didn't hit, in that there are better action scenes in like all of the other movies pretty much. I'm not really, I suppose mainly talking about 1 to 6 here primarily, but I would ultimately say that like there's more of a direction in a way with so many of the other action scenes in 7 and even 8 to a degree. This is just like chaos effectively. It's just a scene for the sake of a scene, not really telling a story. And I don't get why they didn't do it, and that like Duel of the Fates is like the most memorable point for everyone with episode 1. And I'm shocked that they didn't really in any way try to make the Kylo Rey duel like that. I didn't really feel like the music kind of stood out to really emphasize it as like a huge lightsaber fight. I didn't feel the choreography did that way. And by the end, like, it was meant to be a fairly big character moment of the significance of Rey, Leia distracting Kylo, allowing Rey to stab Kylo, but then immediately heal him to show that she still has that sort of, you know, hope for him. Like, there's a good character kind of beat there at the end, but like the fight and the build up to it just wasn't really there. So let's get into the other stuff. Look, let's talk about Palpatine. Palpatine is the problem with this movie. In the sense of like, this movie is a problem because the Palpatine stuff lacks any sort of detail to justify bringing the character back, to justify counteracting the ending of episode 6. The previous thing that was like the end of the saga, that you feel the need to basically make that not as much of an ending and bring back that character because this is a story that needed to be told. Palpatine needed to come back and be defeated by someone else. And that's the problem. That is the biggest problem in all of this. And it stems from the lack of planning in the sequel trilogy overall. That Disney must by now realize that the biggest mistake they made with the sequel trilogy was not planning it out from the start, was changing directors between each movie. In that they arguably did it with the worst like kind of directors in terms of their style, transitioning to like the worst director in terms of their style, and then the worst sequence of directors of like JJ, Ryan, and then back to JJ, of like, you because you didn't do someone new again at the end, you allowed for, you know, what people are talking about with this movie of like, is it almost like through the movie is sort of fighting between the directors? Because that's one way to view this, of like, JJ sets up some stuff in episode 7, Rian Johnson comes in and is like, oh, there's no plan, so I can take these mysteries that JJ has set up in any direction. Let me be super subversive and do everything the opposite of what he would have done. And then JJ comes back in to finish it off and is like, what have you done to all my mysteries? I'm now going to have to like retcon this, explain away this, and to do things the way I wanted to. And it's like, how did you let this happen? It's one of these things where like, people criticize the prequel trilogy, and it's been very interesting to see that come back again in the aftermath of this movie, and a lot of people, I think, being very desperate to try and say that this movie is better than the prequels, and I think that is such an insult to the prequels to say that, you know, the sequel trilogy overall or the Rise of Skywalker as a movie is better than any of the prequels. The prequels have a clear-cut goal. The story that they tell is very cohesive across the three movies in terms of what it says, what it builds to, what it gets to, the story of Anakin's rise and then fall, the rise of Palpatine, and the Revenge of the Sith plan being executed to set up why the Empire is there. It's really well done. And I think the worst thing you can criticize with the prequels is just that, like, okay, some of the dialogue isn't that great, maybe some of the acting isn't directed all that well, but, like, it's not bad acting every scene, every single line of dialogue, every scene. But the story comes across very, very well. And that's exactly what the sequel trilogy doesn't have. There are hints, there are teases of a really clear arc across movies with Kylo Ren, with Rey, but it's so distracted by just how, like, unconnected all of the movies feel to each other because they're done by different directors, because there was no plan, and because there was a sense of a feeling like, you know, directors are trying to contradict each other in all of these cases. And then you add into that the sense of, like, somewhere with all of them, it feels like they're at the same time trying to appeal to fans, but then also trying to counter fan theories. And then they're being somewhat reactive to fan criticism, but then not being reactive to it in other ways. Which is why I think, in a way, the discourse around this movie is just as messy as The Last Jedi, because we have to include The Last Jedi stuff in this. In that, like, I don't really think the massive criticism against The Last Jedi is the reason this movie turned out the way it did. Because if they had listened, I think, to the core criticisms that were really heavily leveled against The Last Jedi, this movie wouldn't have turned out this way. Because most of the people who didn't like The Last Jedi, I get the impression most of them, not all of them, but most of them, really don't like this one either. Because it makes much of the same mistakes that the others do. And it's stuff like, probably the best example of this is people being like, oh, why does Rey have a training scene in this movie? That's just clearly a counterpoint to the fact that everyone wanted to see where Rey's training came from. Why this character can't be just powerful on her own, and, you know, we need to know where her powers come from. So that's why she has a training sequence in this movie to be like, hey, look, she trained, that's why she's this powerful. And it's like, that is not the point that people were making. Because all of Anakin's training in the prequels happens basically off screen. We don't see him in 1, 2, or 3 actually do any training. But because of the way the story is set up, and the time skips between movies, it's clear that he develops over the course of the movie. The difference, though, is that Anakin doesn't, like, suddenly come into episode 2 and out of nowhere have Force lightning. He doesn't go into episode 3 and suddenly be able to just heal with no explanation. He doesn't get any of those powers. Anakin, as of episode 3, one of the most powerful Jedi ever in history, still only really has, like, Force pull, push, choke, the standard, Force amplifying your physical abilities, and then is an amazing lightsaber duelist. That's really where, his skill develops. The problem with Rey is that you have her get all of these new abilities without ever touching on the idea of where they came from. Like, you show a training sequence of her not actually getting trained. She's just running a course. And in that course, she's not demonstrating, like, learning the healing or explaining, like, where that ability came from. The same goes for, like, Force lightning of, like, no one taught her how to do that. The fact that, like, it just happened randomly and you're trying to associate a technique that requires to be learned, and you try to say that, like, oh, because she's a Palpatine, she has an affinity for Force lightning. It's just like, is that how it works? The idea, if you're from a bloodline, is just that you have a high potential in the Force, and with training can develop those abilities when thought. And that's why Anakin, who is the chosen one, virgin birth from the Force, needs 13 years of training or whatever across the 1 and 2 to get to episode 3 to be as powerful as he is. 13 years of training, and he still doesn't have all those like wild Force abilities. Yet, you know, Rey is using Jedi mind trick as like her first application of the Force after finding out that she's a Force user. No one told her about that technique, in that some characters know about the Jedi mind trick, some characters don't. But either way, the idea is that that is a, like, it is a technique that has like subtlety to it. It's not just a raw, powerful application of the Force. There's, you know, technique behind it. In the same way that there's a difference between able to sort of gently levitate something versus being able to just, with like pure force, basically just, you know, force push something crazy. Like there's the difference in subtlety of technique that one requires like learning and training to get versus something else. And that's why, you know, you can't really just justify like Force healing being introduced as being like, oh, she's so powerful she can just like think about it and have it work. The reason it requires an explanation here is because it is a technique that is so clearly like if you're trying to make this connected to the Skywalker saga, how can you introduce that technique but then not really remember the idea of like the Darth Plagueis story? He could save people from dying, and that's what like they're doing like all throughout this movie, is this technique. But then like it's a light side technique, but Darth Plagueis developed it, and it's like, okay, they're clearly different things, but because this is that exact ability, it's kind of like, where was this ability in the prequels? In that, like, if this ability existed, would Anakin need to, would any of what happened to Anakin need to happen? In that if he had this ability, he could have saved his mother. If he had this ability, he could have saved Padme. So where did this come from? It clearly, obviously, didn't exist in the prequels. No one must have had it then. So did Luke discover it in between episode 6 and like the start of the sequel trilogy? Did Leia discover it? Was it taught to her by Leia? I assume so, yes. But like, it's not enough to just be like, oh, but Baby Yoda used it, so that explains everything, doesn't it? There's a difference, though. Baby Yoda is a 50-year-old child of an unknown species that we know nothing about, apart from the fact that the two previous characters of that species were Force sensitive and on the Jedi Council, one of which was like the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. So, you know, this character who is like twice the age of Rey and is still a child from a notable Force sensitive like species, has abilities. And it's just a general, like, it's a character we know nothing about, like, full stop. Like, The Mandalorian just hasn't got around to explaining, like, anything with Baby Yoda yet, not to mention the Force powers. So, okay, cool, everyone likes The Mandalorian, and they introduced that ability. It's a different thing, though. That the movies, you can't just explain away that, like, oh, no, you can't complain about that because it's in something that you actually like. No, like, it needs explanation in both. Like, you need to explain the Force healing in The Mandalorian and in Episode 9, because there's no real, like, connection inherently to it, apart from the fact that they're both in the same universe. But, like, it's not like the explanation, if given in The Mandalorian, suddenly immediately applies to how Rey learned it. And because it's such an inherent plot point to the movie, I'm shocked that they didn't attempt to explain it. And, like, that's the thing, of, like, when you really look at the first 6 movies, they don't introduce, like, any particularly unique Force abilities. It's like, okay, the idea of, like, a Force ghost, they roughly get to with the idea of, like, Qui-Gon as being more unique Jedi, kind of comes to learn this, teach it to Yoda, that's fine. It's a inherent thing of, like, this is where the ability to become one with the Force comes from, and, like, there's a rough explanation behind it. Beyond, like, Force pull and just usual applications of the Force lightning is the only other thing. And because the characters that we see use it are both Sith in Dooku and Sidious, it is an understanding of, like, okay, it's a dark side ability. And guess what? Tyrannus trained under Sidious, that's why he knows how to use the ability. Sidious trained under Plagueis, which is why he knows how to use the ability. Plagueis trained under Tenebrous, which is why he knows how to use the ability. There's the line of training. I'm not sure how you immediately jump to Kylo pushes Rey, so because she's a Palpatine, she uses a technique she has potentially never heard about before or doesn't know anything about, but it just happens. And they're very unclear about, like, did she tap into the dark side of the Force, or is it literally just that they're trying to make the connection because she's a Palpatine? And I don't think that works. Of like, are we now trying to introduce the idea of like bloodline abilities into Star Wars? I don't think so, because the whole idea of bloodlines is just that like it allows for like, you know, a clear-cut way to have like powerful Force users. And I look, that's one of the contradictory points in this movie, of like, Episode 8 made it clear, like, okay, Rey's a nobody. It was told directly, you know, to her by Kylo. They made it out to be a big reveal. The fact that Rey looks into that dark side mirror thing in the cave and sees just herself was meant to be that sort of emphasis of like, where you come from is nothing. It's you, and it's just this because it's proof of like, yeah, kind of like anyone could be powerful in the Force, but like. That's always been a point. Like, I don't get why people view that as being this, like, incredible plot point. It's so brave and profound. And it's like, yeah, because it's not like there's ever a first of a bloodline or anything like that. That, like, you know, if you treat the Darth Plagueis book as being canon, like, Palpatine's father wasn't Force sensitive. It's just that Palpatine happened to be born as being a powerful Force user. And from there, a bloodline starts. Same way with like Shmi Skywalker. Shmi Skywalker's not Force sensitive. Anakin was just born, and from there a bloodline starts. The same goes for like every other Jedi, basically. They're all just kids who, in most cases, do just come from two completely random non-Force sensitive members of that species. Like Kit Fisto, Plo Koon. They're all different species. But it's not like they inherently come from a lineage of Force users. They're all... That's what the Jedi Order is actually so interesting to think about it, is that because it is just like a collection of people from all across the galaxy, it is all of these just kind of, you know, nobodies basically coming together. And that's why like it never particularly hit me that like the whole Rey's a nobody plot point is anything that's particularly profound. I ultimately think it's a better idea to go down that path with Rey rather than feeling the need to make her a Palpatine to sort of, you know, justify anything in a way. But again, it goes into, like, if they did that purely to counteract the Last Jedi hate, then they completely misunderstand what I think most people were trying to say. I think everyone is okay with the idea of a child can be born, and they can be Force sensitive, and they can be very Force sensitive. Like, that's clear cut, in that Mace Windu is, like, one of the most powerful Jedi of all time. But nothing we know about him suggests that he comes from like his power, his midichlorian count came from his parents. He just was born like that. And so because that exists, there's no inherent problem with Rey being a nobody. It's just that you need to show where your characters get these abilities from. You have to, before your character uses all these skills, show them getting any sort of advice in them. And that's the problem of Rey defeats Kylo first time using a lightsaber. Rey uses a Jedi mind trick first time using the Force. By the end of episode 8, after like not even a day of training, basically a few talking scenes with Luke, where he basically just shows her, you know, how to connect with the Force. She's able to just like hand out, no struggle, levitate in all different directions, a whole landslide of rocks and stuff like that. And it's just like, that's where the disconnect is. That's where the disconnect is with the prequel era and how they do sort of powers compared to the things before. Just look at stuff like Kylo's power in The Force Awakens that they forget about. His ability to basically stop time and like freeze stuff in place for a quite long period of time. He uses it like twice, and then it kind of just goes away. In that, like, I'm not even sure if that's exactly the technique that's being used in the fight with Rey and Kylo in this movie. I think it is more of just, you know, Force pushing the lightsaber blow away during that sequence. So it's stuff like that where it feels like they were more focused on like trying to introduce new force powers than just creating solid characters who make sense and so on. So that's just a very frustrating thing about it. But let's get into Palpatine and all the problems with him. What especially watching it for the second time, it became really, really clear. I was shocked that like they literally do not explain how Palpatine came back. You know, Charlie from Lost gives the most vague explanation of like, you know, cloning, dark science, Sith stuff, basically. And it's like, okay, which one of those is it? Like, what combination or specifics is it? How did he survive what happened to him in Episode 6? They don't explain it. How does he have all these supporters? What are those supporters? Exegol, like, how did he end up on Exegol? Who built all the Star Destroyers? Was it built before Episode 6 or afterwards? And then how does like the entire plot structure of this movie even come to be with all those MacGuffins? Who asks for the two Wayfinders to be made? Who makes that Sith dagger? In that, like, clearly they had to have been built after Episode 6, somewhere in between Episode 6 and now, because otherwise it makes no sense that the Sith dagger can has the pattern that matches up the Death Star wreckage. And then, like, what a convoluted system of, like, who placed one of the Wayfinders there so that it could be later found by someone? Like, were we meant to view that as part of, like, Palpatine's scheme, that he knew that, like, one day two of them would rise up? But then, like, they directly say that, like, Kylo finds out about the dyad and the Force before Palpatine does, so that's not even the case. So, what, did Palpatine to find Exegol have to go to his Death Star wreckage or whatever to find it? And then it just links into the idea of, like, if it was all about his followers, who are the followers? Who are those people chanting that get crushed by the rubble in the end? All that sort of stuff. Who's piloting all of these ships? It's so unclear that, like, no one was aware of this until this movie, that all this stuff was being built up. It's crazy because it doesn't justify what it destroys in Episode 6. That Anakin goes from being the chosen one and fulfilling that destiny thanks to Luke helping to redeem his father. That is completely countered here by the fact that he doesn't actually kill him. And if their excuse is literally just that, oh, Anakin brought balance for a time, but something came up since. Like, I don't think anyone's trying to create the argument that, like, balance has to exist forever. That there can never be any threat in the galaxy after Episode 6. Just because of what Anakin did. No one's trying to say that. But the fact that you counter it by having the exact same character he killed to bring balance, bringing him back, that is the problem. And then you go as far, you have the gall to have Hayden Christensen read the line of dialogue to Rey, bring balance like I did. And it's like, technically you didn't bring balance. Technically Rey has now brought balance, and you didn't actually do that in the first place. And this is where, like, I find it shocking, especially watching it the second time, that they didn't use Anakin more. Anakin should have been the character Kylo got to speak to after his defeat by Rey. Anakin should have been the character to defeat the spirit of Palpatine, because that's the biggest plot point, that's the biggest, to me, plot hole in the entire movie. It's that he directly says, the second Rey meets Palpatine, he says that, strike me down and I will, like, my spirit will enter your body and we will be the Empress, basically. I will live in you and it will continue on. The Sith will be reborn once again with you as the Empress, but I'll survive within you. He says that, confirming to us that if they kill him, his spirit won't be killed also. They never explain anything in this movie about why anything changes from him saying that at the start of that sequence to him dying at the end of the sequence. In that nothing makes his death by Rey more final than his death at Darth Vader's hands. In that, look, okay, he explodes, but, like, if he can transfer his spirit out of his body, why does it matter that his body exploded? she still killed him. Why can't he just go into her body then? Because this is where they should have used that. You'd already set it up. Use that. Have Palpatine's spirit suddenly be a thing. And him try to enter Rey's body, but the spirit of Anakin strikes down Palpatine. That way, Rey still gets her big moment. She defeats the new threat and proves herself to be the Jedi. She gets her arc, but Anakin also gets to still be the chosen one. He, as himself, as Jedi Anakin Skywalker, one with the Force, gets to once and for all defeat the person who manipulated him. That is storytelling. And to me, it feels like they were just cowards with this, and that they thought that people who don't like the prequels would criticize this movie for including Anakin Skywalker, Hayden Christensen, because apparently people think he's a bad actor. Not acknowledging the fact that Hayden's been going back to conventions and has been getting great reception from fans. Not acknowledging the fact that the prequels have the opinion in general, I think, has swung on them. And especially when most people think of 3 before they think of 1 and 2. I don't think there's really a problem with that. And if it comes out and is confirmed that there were cuts of this movie that included Hayden Christensen in more of a physical role, I don't know how they didn't keep them. Who decided to change it to just be Anakin's voice among many? That Anakin's voice is considered on the same level as like Adi Gallia, as Ayla Secura. You know, that Anakin is just a voice among like Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, Yoda, Ahsoka, and all these cool references and all to get across the idea of, you know, all the Jedi and stuff like that. But how you don't ever once emphasize the character who the first 6 movies are about. The character who is ultimately, in a way, behind like much of like why Kylo has his arc in the first place in so many ways. Who is connected to Rey in a way. How you don't have him appear and say more beyond just bring balance like I did, go Rey, and stuff like that. It's a real problem, and I don't get it. And that's where like I think this movie is so weird with the way it's being referential. Of like, a lot of people say this movie is super fan servicey, but like it is in certain points, but then in certain points it absolutely isn't, in that it feels like they're terrified to reference some things. And I don't get why they didn't. Like, why would you put Ahsoka in, but not include Anakin in a bigger way? It's just very confusing to me. Because you get situations like the scene between, say, Kylo and Han Solo. It's a very nice scene, but the details of it are confusing because it's like, they confirm within the scene it's a memory. But it is a weird scene with regards to this being fundamentally the scene that like finally turns Kylo back into Ben. That it's just him remembering the scene of his father, you know, offering that chance to come back, the scene where he killed him, and just like kind of like applying in his head different dialogue to his father. You sort of get what it was going for, but it would have been more impactful to actually just have it be a Force ghost and use the logic of Star Wars to make it happen. In that, yes, the reference to 7 is good and what happened, but Han Solo isn't Force sensitive, so I think there would have been more impact to have the similar character traits of Anakin and Kylo work in your favor, of Anakin fell and then was redeemed, to highlight to Kylo, you can be redeemed as well. If I could be, as far as I went as Vader, you still have that opportunity. Like that Luke still had faith in me at the end. People still have faith in you right now as far as you've gone. That's the scene to have with Kylo. Maybe you could have had something with Han, maybe not as big or as focused on here, but I think you needed Anakin in some way to make that happen. And then you get into like all the weird stuff of like, okay, the Force dyad, 2 are 1, and the 2 heal the 1, and Palpatine's plan changes because he realizes just how powerful they are, and that he can Force drain them to like heal himself, and it's like, where's that ability? Like, is that not exactly like the sort of ability you were talking about with Darth Vader, about like, we'll learn Plagueis' techniques of just like, that's kind of some way to heal someone that might that might work. Did he have that ability before? I'm not sure. It just felt like we need to get Palpatine off this crane arm, so he heals himself from them. He does the crazy lightning into the sky, and then for some reason his lightning after that is just normal. Which is where we get into, I think, the most problematic lines in probably all of Star Wars in so many ways. Of just like, you really wrote that down. You really had the actors say that. And then the movie shows basically nothing of it. That Palpatine multiple times in this movie says, I am all of the Sith. And he's implying that, like, the kind of the spirits of all of the Sith are within him. He has the power now of every Sith put together. And that's why he's able to do that crazy, like, lightning thing into the sky. And then Rey connects with the previous Jedi and is basically just says the exact same thing. The problem, though, is that the final clash between all of the Sith and all of the Jedi, Palpatine versus Rey, is literally just the Mace Windu Palpatine sequence, but with two lightsabers. Which is a nice reference in that, like, Windu came the closest of everyone to killing Palpatine. So it's an ability that makes sense. But, like, how silly is Palpatine to just continue with the spirit fingers, just going, like, you know, crazy, trying to, you know, force through when he knows that this is this thing that can counteract it. And the fact that, yeah, his lightning doesn't seem any more powerful. Is this all the Sith? Is this what all the Sith can do? And then, like, what exact power are all of the Jedi giving Rey to just hold up two lightsabers? In that, like, is she even using the Force necessarily in that? Because, look, the whole Mace Windu thing and the explanation of what he's doing is only really done in the novelization. As it is, it's just this basic explanation of if you hold a lightsaber in front of Force lightning, it eventually gets to the point where you're reflecting it back. Fair enough. So she does it with two and blows them up. But why did you need to say that line about all of the Sith, all of the Jedi, and so on? In that, like, you had to have Luke set it up as well before and say, you know, 1,000 generations live in you. And it's like that's... What is that? Like, it's such a big line, but it's such a vague line because they don't do anything with it. And it's where, like, if you were doing something like that, you probably needed to go all out with it and have literally, like, almost like temporarily at least, like the Force ghost of all these Jedi that talk to her behind her, directly channeling energy into her to make some sort of a power boost type thing happen. The same with Palpatine. You have this sort of, you know, ancient Sith spirits just, like, appear through this ritual somehow. It's different than Force ghosts. And you show, here's Plagueis, Bane, Tenebrous, all these characters, Undeadu, you know, all the other Sith. And you actually have that, it be that clash of Jedi versus Sith. But it's not. And they try to make it that way with that line. And that's this movie. That's this entire movie. It's telling you stuff, not showing you stuff. And I really can't get behind most of the Palpatine stuff because of that. They don't explain where he came back. The fact that the whole explanation of Snoke is, I made Snoke. And we see two Snokes in a vat. And it's like, fine, okay. That sort of connects things together. But it's such a, like, last minute, oh yeah, we had this planned out. He was this, it was every voice in his head. There was no character arc like that thing. It's just pretty bad. And then, yeah, how is Rey blowing him up with the redirected lightning more of a final death that, like, stops the essence transfer thing from being able to happen? Nothing is explained about that. Why does Rey die after this? Because there was no, visually, they didn't really show the idea that, like, she's hit by the lightning ever. So is it just she dies from exertion? And then, like, Ben comes back and, like, he's light now, so he can use the healing as well, despite potentially not knowing where the technique comes from. But fine, he uses it. The romance thing, I actually don't mind too much. Like, I know a lot of people think it's this kind of abusive relationship or whatever, but, like, I can sort of get behind it. There's not much romance in Star Wars. They did some decent stuff in 8 with them. They did some okay stuff in this movie with them. Fine. Do that. Do something different. Like, why do they have to kill off Ben Solo? Why couldn't they have him survive? And this is where there's this weird relationship with these movies and the past and trying to do something different. of like, it feels like they're trying to make it all about the new characters, but then they always have to have it be sort of referencing the old characters. So Ben has to have the same sacrificial death that Anakin does. We can't possibly have him survive. But why? Why not? Why couldn't you have that unique ending where they do both survive and they are this couple going forward and it's this huge positive for the galaxy? And it would have been so much better to have the two of them on Tatooine burying those lightsabers and, you know, going their own path. Rather than just Rey. Because the problem with the final scene, once again, is that it is confusing with regards to what exactly are they trying to say. Does it mean more for Rey to abandon the name Palpatine and take on the name Skywalker, given that most of this movie was about don't be afraid of who you are. Accept who you are. That just because you come from an evil lineage doesn't mean you yourself are evil. So what does it say about Rey that she drops the Palpatine name and feels the need to take on the name of the good guys? Would it not be more impactful and meaningful for her to say Rey Palpatine and just commit to it? Like, yeah, I'm perfectly fine with it. I can be a Jedi, but I can also be a Palpatine. That I don't need to take on the name Skywalker to still sort of represent what they do. And that's the problem with it. It just feels too much. Like, you know, she's given Luke's X-Wing. She's given Luke and Leia's lightsaber. You know, she has the Falcon. Now she goes back to where Luke lives to bury those lightsabers and potentially live. I don't know if they were making that out that she's going to live there or not. But you know, either way, you know, the ending on that note, it's just like, it's so obvious what is going to be said, and it just doesn't work. I'm not sure. You look at this from Palpatine's perspective. If he was sort of, you know, fully dead, watching this from some nether region or something like that, he can't come back. How would he view Rey saying that? I think there'd be a sense of him and be like, you know, I lost, but what does it mean that, like, my grandchild has taken the name Skywalker? The one truly powerful Force-sensitive being left in the galaxy is a Palpatine, like, now taking on the name Skywalker. There's more meaning, I think, behind that. I think Palpatine would be more frustrated with the idea of, like, the last Force-sensitive being left in the galaxy is a Palpatine, and she's still using my name, but in a good way. That's more impact. Or just commit to the whole idea of, what's your name? Rey. I don't have a family name. I'm not a Skywalker or a Palpatine. I accept that I am my own thing. I'm not defined by my lineages. I think, you know, there's probably an argument for all three, but I actually think the worst one is the Skywalker decision. I think that's the version of this that works the least. And I don't get what they were going for. The same again, I mentioned it already, with the lightsaber. Why show that lightsaber looking the way it does, only ignite one of the blades, and have the movie end on the note of, like, you're never going to see her use this thing. This is the end of the Skywalker saga, and we've ended on the exact same notes that we ended Episode 6 on. Of, like, the fight is over, Rey is left, there's potential for the New Republic to come back again, there's potential for a new Jedi Order. That's exactly how 6 ended. So we had 3 whole movies with the sole goal that, in big picture terms, all they accomplished was messing up the ending of this movie to give the exact same ending to the new characters. You couldn't do, in the end, anything new with them. And that's why Kylo, you should have, I think, kept him alive. At least it's something different going forward, where you had the full happy ending. There was no need for a sacrifice. That they both survived, they're now in a relationship, and we can just go forward with that. I think there's more impact behind that, and at least there's a unique dynamic with a relationship that could actually happen. And it would mean something different for the Jedi as well, of, like, Rey going forward, with a Jedi Order that accepts romance and love as being a more part of it, and that's the big change she makes to the Jedi going forward. There's impact behind that, but it just, to me, doesn't work. Watching the movie again, on the other side of things, it was pretty clear to me that what Finn was going to say to Rey was that he was Force sensitive, because when Rey dies, Finn, not being in any way in the same scene as her, senses it. And that, I think, is confirmation that he was Force sensitive. So that's at least something kind of new I got from the movie. But yeah, they're my secondary thoughts on this movie. I don't think it's absolutely awful, but there's enough mistakes, there's enough lack of detail that it just really does bring the movie down for me. So yeah, I think it's still going to take some time for me to fully reflect on this, but I really do feel that it's not the best Star Wars movie at all, and not a good way to end on it. But thankfully there's other good stuff happening. Clone Wars, Mandalorian, stuff like that. So there are my thoughts on the movie. In the comments let me know what your thoughts are, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.